welcome to iWizard Side Quests. I'm thrilled to introduce sci-fi and fantasy author C.S. Friedman. Celia is a New York Times notable author and has published around 24 novels and short works. Her published series include the Endless War duology, the Coldfire Trilogy, the Outworld series, the Magister Trilogy, and the Dreamwalker series. And her latest Coldfire novel, Nightborn, will be released on Tuesday, July 18th. Yay, thanks for being here, Celia.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited about this.
Want to jump into talking a little more about Coldfire since Nightborne's coming out, and I just absolutely love the world that you created. Erna is just this beautiful, magical place. So you want to talk a little bit about where your idea came from in developing the world?
You know, I can't tell you where it came from, but I can tell you how it came, which is that I had the concept for the characters a long time before I wrote the book. It could have been my second book. And I thought, you know, I'm not writing this story until I have a magic system and a world that is worthy of it. So I don't know where it came from, but I will tell you there was about 3 years of playing with it in the back of my mind. And I'm a very scientific fantasy person. Even with fantasy, I like when it follows natural law and you get the feeling that the magic could be a real thing.
Right.
And so from there, it was a pretty straightforward step to the concept that, well, there is magic. It's a natural force. It's actually a scientific force. We just don't understand it. It looks like magic. And then from there, it's like, okay, what could it do? It has to follow the laws of thermodynamics, conservation of energy. And, you know, fuel has to equal output. So it has to come from somewhere. It has to be expendable in some form, shape, or manner. How do we control it? And I think my inspiration for the Fae was really California wildfires that year. Because I was watching them and I was thinking, well, this is what a natural force does. Fire is probably what kicked off the whole evolution into the modern human being. You know, that gave us cooking, that gave us safety, and everything else followed from there. But when it's out of control, it is completely and absolutely destructive. I wanted the same thing. I thought wind is the same way. We have terrible hurricanes and tornadoes, but obviously the movement of air is important. Water, we have to have it, but we have floods and monsoons. Everything that is in nature, we have learned how to channel it, but we have never learned how to control it. And I decided that was
is that also why you upended the scientific method on Erna, that nothing's predictable because of
that was a kind of deduction on my part. Because once I decided that I had something that was responding to human psyche, which obviously was inspired in part by the Forbidden Planet, what science fiction writer isn't. But once I decided that, then I had to ask myself, what would happen? You know, if my thoughts can impact everything around me, but I'm not in control of how it does so all the time, what would happen to technology? And I remember, okay, anecdote time. I used to hang out with the Brigade of the American Revolution, which reenacted 18th century. And I remember one day we were firing muskets at a target. And I was pretty scared of guns. And the sound of the gun really shook me. And I did not see how I was going to be able to fire this thing. And the guy in charge said, just try it. It'll be okay. And it was fine, and I didn't have any problem with it. I realized what happened was I was watching the flash into the pan. I understood where it was going. I understood what it was doing. And because I was witnessing the process, it didn't scare me. Whereas with the other gun, I pull the trigger, there's a very loud noise and a bullet comes out. But I wasn't mentally there with the path of causation.
Right.
And so that's what happens on Erna. If you have something which is so complicated that the mind it's an abstract thing that you could just worry about it not working. Those are the things that are vulnerable. They don't have engines. I mean, they don't have the kind of engines we have, but they refer to turbines on one of the boats, so they have that. A turbine is a very, very simple engine format. Steam goes in, things go up and down, wheels turn. You can sit there and watch it. And there's even a reference to the fact that the captain of the ship goes down to watch it when it starts up. And he's looking at it going, yeah, that works, I got that. So it was a little bit of the things that seem mysterious to us that we can't watch and we can't witness and we can't see. Those are the things that can go wrong the most. And then, as you can see, Tarrant's carrying a gun, and they remark upon that as an incredible sign of power, because it means that his mind is so in control of what he's emanating that he knows he's not emanating any negative energy towards the gun. So the people who have this much power can use higher technology. And of course, most of the original technology was destroyed, which is what Nightborne is about. It's about that moment when Erna shifts. Are you excited to show it now? Here we go. Here's my book. So it kind of built over literally years, you know, and I'm so happy with it. And then it was like, well, where does it come from? And I had to pick places where it could be generated. Again, we don't know how. We don't know what the connection is to earthquakes, but we know the movement of tectonic plates is connected to this stuff. Whether it releases it or generates it, we have no idea.
Right.
But that makes it tie into the whole planet. And the tidal fate goes into the tides, and the solar fate links to the sunlight.
So it seems like you're playing off the fundamental forces too, right? We have our fundamental forces, right? The electromagnetic spectrum, so like radiation, we get gravity, we have the elastic forces, right? From like the rocks breaking and earthquakes. Yeah.
There's a little treat in Nightborne, which new readers won't get. It's my little treat for people who read the trilogy, which is where something really terrible happens. And it happens right after an earthquake happened. And they haven't figured it out yet, but the trilogy readers will all understand that the entire landscape was awash with power right after that. And that is why this thing happened of a magnitude greater than anything else that went on. So the more I worked with it, the more I wanted it to fit into natural law. And I think that's part of what people have responded to. My question was, if magic existed, what would it work like, and what would it look like, and how would it work?
And I love that you have this, it's almost a hard magic system in that there are like fundamental rules, but you don't cram it down into your readers. Like you give them enough to figure it out, but you never explain it.
Well, and you never figure it all out. That's
exactly. Yeah.
That was one of the challenges with Nightborne, if I can jump a little. Nightborne expands upon an incident that's mentioned in the prologue to the second book, which is the founding of Erna, and the actions, I'm trying for no spoilers here, and the actions that cause most of the Earth technology to be destroyed. So that not only wasn't it working really well, it wasn't there. And it's that series of events, but it's mostly about the desperation of the colonists who showed up on this planet. They don't have a depth yet, so no one can see this stuff. There's nothing like it on Earth, so they're not going to think it's there. All they know is they are on the planet where weird things are happening, and they seem to be responding to psychic images that particular person has, but not necessarily what they're thinking at that moment. And that's all they know. And this is the generation that has to figure out enough about the Fae to figure out how to control it enough to survive. And that's what Nightborne really is. It's a bunch of science-minded people dumped in the middle of what appears to be a magical system. Deep inside, they know it's not a magical system because magic does not exist and everything must be scientifically explainable. Right. But oh my God, invisible forces are creating monsters. How do I make those two things work together? So that's the struggle and the really interesting part of Nightborne for me, on top of the fact that they're panicking and they'll all die if they don't figure it out. So it's a really tense book.
So I'm going to jump a little too. So what made you want to return to Coldfire after all this time? I know that you came out with Dominion. Was it last year or the year before?
No, it was about 10 years ago.
Oh, really?
Well, I should mention for those who don't know what we're talking about 10 years ago, I wrote an early Gerald Tarrant story. And it's from a pivotal moment in his history. He mentions in the trilogy that he had originally just been a vampire, your basic blood-sucking vampire. Right. That's all he was. That he hated it, that it was like a half-life, there was violence, it was messy. And now he is something more, and he has passed beyond that, and now he feeds on psychic energy and fear. What changed him? And I thought, well, okay, that's one of the really interesting moments that I never expanded upon. So it tells the story of Gerald Tarrant's arrival in the forest for the first time, which is the forest before he's influenced it, and of what happens to him that enables him to begin feeding on fear as opposed to blood, which is the big transformation. So you get the view of him before, and you know where it's headed. So I had self-published that. So it had a nice distribution, but not on the par with, a dull hardcover.
Mm-hmm.
So we decided to include it in this volume.
Oh,
so
great.
you all get to read it. So it's Nightborne, the novel,
Mm-hmm.
and then Dominion, the story. And I also had a lot of fans of Dominion who kept asking me to please put it out in hardcover, but it was too short to do on its own. So now it's in this. And I have worked on a timeline project where I am trying to get the entire history. I'm going to look at something while I talk to you.
Okay.
I'm going to try to get the entire history of Erna. Okay, here's the opening page to Dominion. Can you see it?
Yes.
Year 613.
Yes.
So I'm putting together a timeline. We have about 1,200 years of history on Erna, in which every single event and every period of time will eventually be dated.
Mm-hmm.
It's on my website, csfriedman.com. And so now I can write stories in all different parts of the Erna history, and readers know exactly where to slot it in. They know what came before what. You don't have to read them in order because you know where they go.
So if you're making this elaborate timeline, is it going to come with a map by any chance of Erna?
My editor is talking about doing a reissue of the trilogy, and it will have a map, and it will have the timeline.
Oh, that's going to be so helpful.
The map just lost out to, I don't draw maps very well, and this was before the AI art programs. I mean, at this point, you just call up the AI and you go, I need a map, I need mountains over there, go do it, make it look nice. Nah, make it look like something else. But back then I had to either draw it by hand, to draw it by hand. I wasn't up to it. It's a really complicated map because all the travel times have to be right. So it's not obvious this goes here, this goes here, this goes here. They race horses across the landscape at one point, and I have to make sure that distance is short enough that they can get where they're going. I can't just lay them out. So the whole thing would be much more expanded if I didn't have a few timelines that have to work in there. So it just became too much, with finishing the book. And I was a new writer, and finishing the book was still a big challenge. And we didn't have word processors like we have today. So literally finishing the book was a big challenge. So it just kind of lost. Yes, it's going to be in the reissue. So
it's so exciting.
When it comes out, you'll all want it.
And the other thing, so it sounds like the Fae came before Erna, then the idea for the Fae.
Yes, Erna was designed around the Fae.
Okay.
I mean, really, the only thing that makes Erna interesting is the Fae. I mean, later the Rock came into it, but hello, cat. But
yeah, they'll be wandering around. I have 3 of them.
That's fine. So. But the Rock are a construct of the Fae. They're a native species that was totally unremarkable until people started going, well, they've got a lot of human traits. I bet if we hadn't showed up, these would be the human beings of Erna. This is the species that would have become like us. And now you have every single human being on Erna thinking, wow, that species is going to be just like us. So you know what happens. It affects their evolution, and they start to become more and more like us, and you have an obvious conflict. But everything on that planet is generated either by the very intense tectonic activity or by what the Fae is doing to all the life forms, because they're all hooked into it. The Fae has a problem with us because we have a multi-layered consciousness. I mean, if your friend is coming over, you have great feelings. You really want to see her. You have all the affection you feel for your friend. Your house is a mess. You wish she wasn't coming now. Maybe you said something last week you're really embarrassed about. Maybe deep inside you're nursing some resentment towards her, about something that you haven't talked about in a while. Layer after layer after layer, and most of it's unconscious, and you don't even know what the layers are.
Right. And the rocks are more instinctual.
Right. The Fae doesn't know which one to respond to. It may just pick up, God, I wish she wasn't coming over. Instead of, I'm really happy I'm going to see her. And so that's what's happening. It's responding to people mentally, but it's responding randomly. And some of them, it's giving them what they fear. Some of them, it's giving them what they want. But at this point in the story, they have no control over it. By the time of the trilogy, some people have control over it. And what they have gained control over is how to emanate the thing that they want the fate to reflect, and only that.
So sorcerers have figured out a way to control
Yes, they can
their
control it.
feelings a little,
They
and
can
emotions
control
a
it.
little more.
And the first thing they learn to do is alter their sight
Yeah.
so that they can actually see it. But that's a conscious effort they have to make. And in Nightborne, I had to figure out, how do they do it? How did the very first person figure out what is essentially their sorcery to make his eyes sensitive to this thing? And that was a pretty big story challenge. And it's very interesting.
And do we get any kind of sense of the origins of the adepts in Nightborne?
Of the what?
The adepts, those like born with.
The adepts are basically evolution. They're not discussed there because they haven't come into play yet. But they're basically the human species adapting to the Fae, and the Fae adapting to the human species. And just as the native species can all see the Fae, I mean, it's just a part of the landscape to them, the human species is starting to produce human beings who can see the Fae. That doesn't give them control over it necessarily, but in actual practical effect, it does, because if they can totally see it and see how it works all the time, obviously it's much easier to experiment and figure out how to control it. But that comes into it later. I'm imagining Gerald Tarrant was one of the first, because that's his story is about 300 years into this.
Right.
They haven't been around a very long time. And for the first time, you're getting people who are growing up with this weird light show and strange powers. And I'm trying to decide now how late in life that happens, because otherwise you run into a Twilight Zone thing of this little immature kid with tremendous power, so the age at which you learn to control the Fae is like absolutely pivotal to this planet.
So when they see the Fae, do they appear different colors, like the dark Fae versus the Earth Fae?
The Earth Fae is what Michael Whalen did on his cover illustration, which I seem to have failed to.
Well, I have these in front of me.
That's it. See all the blue stuff going around the bottom?
That's
his interpretation of the Fae. Streamers of light. It's described as looking like water.
So the Earth Fae. So I imagine the dark Fae being blue because of Coldfire, but the Earth Fae is blue.
The Earth Fae is blue. It's like electric blue. The dark Fae is that deep purple when you have an ultraviolet light. It's like right at the edge of what a human can see. Really intense dark purple. The solar Fae they see as golden. No one has ever described seeing the Fae itself, but the result is golden. And the tidal Fae isn't described with colors at all. That's described as more of a kind of touchy-feely thing that you can feel the rhythms of the universe. If you go look up bioluminescence, that's the color. And that's really the look of it. I wanted it washing across the earth like water, and it has currents, and it has directions, and it has tides, and there are times it flows more strongly than others.
Yeah, I love that.
So it's really, and you have to know what direction to work in. It may be that malevolent magic works better in one direction and benevolent magic works better in another, because that thread of the Fae happens to be heading off in that direction in that area. So really, you would, a sorcerer would like have Fae maps, knowing where everything was in the area. So, and then about a couple of months ago, I saw my first video of bioluminescent beaches, which is where the water washes up and the algae that's in it begins to glow. And it's exactly that blue.
Right.
And it's exactly that glow and that look. So I have to say, if you go look at videos of bioluminescence on the ocean shore, you're going to get something that looks very, very similar to the Fae, except it's on land.
Yeah. And so with Tarrant, then, you had mentioned that your idea for the characters came even before the magic system. And I had read as part of your biography that you were writing vampire novels as a teenager. So is that like did the idea for Tarrant start then or a little later?
It's a combination of two things. I was actually reading something about the Jesuits. And I was reading that as part of their research, they often studied things that normally the church didn't want worshippers studying, forbidden subjects, if you will. because they needed to understand them. And it was part of their intellectual duty to understand things like that. So suddenly I had this image of someone who was part of this very restrictive church, wanted knowledge, was in that gray area where there was something special about him that allowed him to seek out that knowledge, but it was still forbidden knowledge. You know what I mean? It's like walking that fine edge of what's allowed, what's okay, what's going to work. And that is, of course, the balancing act that he does his whole life and ultimately falls off the tripwire, falls off the high wire, doesn't keep the balance, goes over to one side. And so that was the human part of it. Recently, I was rereading a book by Tanith Lee called Knight's Master, which I consider one of the greatest fantasy books ever written. And she is one of my primary inspirations for writing style. Her stuff is so beautiful and emotive. I mean, the sentences are so gorgeous. And I had forgotten Knight's Master. And it's kind of the ultimate anti-hero book in the way that mine is, where the anti-hero isn't like evil so much as amoral, without any morals. The hero of that book is a demon who basically does not care for humankind at all. We're here for his amusement. He doesn't have any emotions that we can relate to. He does some phenomenally cruel things just offhand, just doesn't care. And yet he's fascinating. And there is, among other things, that elegant darkness, that sense of political power and sophistication in the demon world. And I realize now how much that book inspired Gerald Tarrant. Tanith Lee was playing with the essence that made the modern vampire appealing. And that book, I just can see Gerald Tarrant coming to life as I read it. So I think now, looking back, that was responsible. So anybody who loves him should go read the book.
Great plug. And so on that note, are there any other works, whether it's literature or TV or movies, that have inspired you?
Well, for this book, no, that pretty much covers it. For this Alien Shore, I acknowledged the writings of Cordwainer Smith. I actually stole a few ideas outright. They're very different in my book, but I love the concept that whatever hyperspace is that lets you go faster than light, that there would be predators in that universe that wanted to eat people. I mean, that was just, and that's, I think, from his story, The Game of Rat and Dragon, where people are mind melding with house cats to kill massive, invisible, dragon-like creatures in hyperspace. He was the most bizarre imagination ever. So I stole that and some terminology, and I acknowledged him. But for that one, most of the inspiration came from nonfiction reading, in particular Oliver Sacks, who...
Oh, I have him over here.
Yeah. Do you have Anthropologist on Mars?
No, it's Musicophilia.
You must read Anthropologist on Mars. It's his best. And a lot of this Alien Shore was inspired by it. And you can see it as you read it, that the characters came from that. He investigates various mental, what we call disabilities. Obviously, they're not in the book. And tries to get into the mindset of what's happening and how it affects their thinking, and looks for the fact that there might be positive aspects to it. He's looking for the big picture, not just like, well, Tourette's has these problems. How do they get around it? But one of the people he interviews is actually a surgeon with Tourette's, which is probably the last profession you would expect someone with Tourette's.
Right, so you have to be in total control of your fine motor skills.
So he interviews the guy and talks to him about how that works. He was one of the very first ones to interview Temple Grandin, who was one of the first autistic adults to talk about her experience and her internal reality in terms that others could understand. So Anthropologist on Mars has a series of chapters in which basically each one takes a mental disability and explores the reality of it and how it affects the person and what the possible positive side effects are. And that's the theme of this Alien Shore, that you have one people where neural development doesn't always function in a totally reliable way. So they have these conditions in their society, lots and lots of people with lots and lots of things that are not neurotypical. And they have learned to accept them and absorb them and exploit each one for what it does best. so that they are points of pride and constructive creativity rather than something they resent and try to get around.
So that seems like, is that a theme to your works then, that you try to put your characters in some kind of environment or situation where they're just really not in control and they have to figure it out?
I think my fascination with science fiction and fantasy, I want to put you in the head of someone who doesn't think like you would expect a normal human to think. Whether that is an alien, whether that is a human who has mutated to adapt to a planet and is no longer neurotypical, whether it's somebody who's seeing power every minute of the day, whether it's somebody who's trying to perform science experiments on a world where you can't perform science experiments, basically. And I should explain that for those who haven't read the book, since the Fae responds to human cognition, and worrying about something can screw it up. The simple fact that you do an experiment 2 times means you could have 2 different results depending on your state of mind. So nothing is reliable, and none of the technology you would use to explore the world is reliable. And there's a great scene in Black Sun Rising where Tarrant has created one small little space where there is no Fae. And to him, the concept of a world with no magic is magical. I mean, it's supernatural. It's almost beyond comprehension.
Right.
And it
Like
would
what?
change all of the laws to be on our world. Some of the people on Erna consider would be the most awesome thing in the universe, but it would also be freaky scary.
Right.
You know, you have a whole world suddenly that doesn't care if you exist. On Erna, the entire planet's responding to you. It's kind of like a Gaia, but with a personal relationship with you.
Have
And
you have you read Gaia before?
not the book, but I know the theory.
Yeah.
And it's nothing like it in what it is. There's no planetary consciousness, but it acts like it.
Mm-hmm.
When you get into very complicated magic or technology, we do tend to personify it. And you do tend to say, well, I mean, as it says on the little bookmark that I made for the Nightborne, it says, what do you do when the planet that you want to live on wants to kill you?
Right. And the
Nothing
idea of
wants to kill
Gaia,
them. Yeah, there's nothing positive or negative. There's no consciousness, absolutely nothing. It's just a disembodied force. But when you look at the effect, we tend to imagine a Gaia force like this is the whole planet in a kind of what was that 3D movie whose name I'm forgetting?
one more time,
3D movie with blue people who hook up to the planet.
Avatar.
Avatar. Avatar came out around
Yeah.
the time this was getting to be big, and you know they actually physically hooked up to the planet.
Yeah,
People,
they have some stuff in Avatar that looks like the Fae.
yeah, they do. Well, once I saw the bioluminescence, now I understand why it's all over the place, because that look is actually on our world.
Yeah.
And the blue that I envisioned is the cobalt blue you get on a computer screen.
Right.
So these are all kind of common visions. And actually, one of the characters in Nightborne, one of her theses in school when she studied it and that she teaches, is that there are symbols that we absorb without knowing it. Whether or not you believe those symbols, you know what they are. And your mind will recognize what they are, even if you've never consciously studied them. No one's ever actually taught them to you. Things like blue is connected to electricity because when we turn on the electrical components, that is the color of the display when we first started.
Mm-hmm.
Little things like that, and we don't think about them, but later on, the color has that significance to everybody.
Right. And I love that Tarrant's life mission basically was to also evolve a horse on
Yes.
Erna.
Yes, I have to figure out how evolved they are in the early stages now.
Yeah.
That does the detail. Like I have to go back now and I have to go, oh my God, I described exactly how I did that. And there's one point in which one of the Zandu is looking at a horse and going, oh, poor little thing, like doesn't have 3 toes or
I
something.
love that chapter. That's from the Zandu's perspective. That was so creative.
Well, that's it. Like I said, my pleasure is in getting you into the mind of something whose world paradigm is different. They view the world in a different way than we do. They respond to reality in a different way than we do. I want you to get into their head, and I want you to experience being that person or that creature. And that's what I enjoy the most about science fiction and fantasy, I think.
And So as far as outlining and constructing your books, do you write them in order, like chapter by chapter, or do you move stuff around?
I do whatever works. And
Yeah.
in my early books, I jumped around a lot.
Yeah.
And certainly for my first book, In Conquest Born, the chapters are held together by chronology, but they're not one leading to the next. And in this Alien, sure, also and I have multiple plot lines. So if one day I wasn't excited about what I was doing, I'd go jump to another chapter.
Right.
The longer I write, the more I'm tending to work chronologically, because it's easier to see what I'm developing and how it's leading me into the next thing. But it's not sacred. If I feel like writing the end of a book tomorrow, I'll write the end of the book. This comes down to, should I discuss this? Way back when I was a youngin', well, not that young, my writing ability was cyclical. My creativity was cyclical. And there was no question it was tied to my menstrual cycle. So it was hormonal. Never figured out quite which hormone, but you could chart my creative ability literally on the hormone chart of the month, which meant that I knew when the peak days would be.
Yeah.
I knew exactly on what day I could write something brilliant. And I saved the things that had to be brilliant for those days. So when I still had that going for me, it was estrogen or testosterone. We never figured out which.
I think the testosterone kind of rises at the start of the cycle. And that's like when your thinking becomes clearest.
I think it peaks during ovulation. I think it goes kind of with the estrogen, which is why we never figured out which it was. But my hot days were like in the middle of the cycle and 3 days right before. I mean, basically, I had the most awesome PMS ever.
Okay. So that's what worked for you.
That's what worked for me. So I knew those 3 days I was going to rock, and everything I wrote would be brilliant, and my sentences would be beautiful, and my imagery would be powerful. And I just saved the stuff that had to be that good for those days.
So is that why only the female rocks could access the title, Fae? Because they're on that cycle?
Women have a more powerfully defined physical cycle in their bodies because of that. Their whole body is all the hormones and everything. It's all kind of going together. Men have some cycles, but nothing which that powerfully affects the body. So yes, that is why women can kind of cue into the whole tidal effect when all the tides of the planet and the tides of the water and gravity and the seasons, every tidal change is constantly making a mathematical graph with highs and lows. And when they all peak at the same time, it generates power. And for the woman, she has days that peak. And if hers peaks when everything else peaks, then you get that connection where they can use the tidal Fae, and men can't. I generally hate books where one sex can't use the power. Well, it's funny, Magister does that too. I hate it when there's no reason. But
that's a definite reason.
Yeah, that's a definite reason. Yeah, and I now, having moved in life beyond that point, I would not have access to the tidal Fae in the same way anymore because the cycle's gone.
So you don't retain any kind of memory of it or anything that
you have memory. You understand intellectually how it works, but your ability to be conscious part of it diminishes.
Right.
Because it's your cycle connecting to all the other cycles that makes it click.
Yeah. And so when you're putting together your books, George R. Martin says that there are two types of writers. There are architects and there are gardeners. So which one are you?
Well, first of all, I'm in between. I think that that's also the pants versus planner.
Right.
By the seat of your pants versus planning. I wish I could outline completely and plan everything out. I really want to. I've tried so hard. But a lot of my ideas don't come to me until I've written what comes before it. You know what I mean? Yeah. I know how Tarrant will behave in the middle of the book because I've already written a few chapters in the beginning and worked that out.
Right.
So to some degree, I can't plan beyond a certain point. Usually I have about 10 chapters ahead. Then I have some of the major ideas for the next section. And then I have kind of vague ideas and an ending. And as I write, more and more. So, excuse me. So I guess I'm a little more scattered, but I wish I weren't, and I'm trying really hard because it's so much easier to write with an outline. I mean, I can't believe it. The few times I've had one, it was so easy. You know, you sit down, you know what you have to write. There it is. There's the assignment for today. Finish this. Here's the scene. Go do it.
Right.
As opposed to sitting down and going, well, I need a chapter about Tarrant at this point, and it has to be dark. And my idea is, and then you stare at the screen for like 5 hours.
I know. And then as you're going, it's like, okay, now I know where this is going, but yeah.
Or now I know where it needs to be. I always know the ends of my books.
Yeah.
Sometimes that betrays me because I'm trying not to get really awkward as I head towards the end I want. You know, it can't feel artificial. But on the other hand, everything has to head in that direction. I will tell you a great story. My favorite anecdote.
Okay.
So I'm doing a panel, and all the other writers on the panel are fantasy writers, and we're in a library. And somebody asks about the writing process. And the first woman tells a story how she's writing a book and she couldn't get the scene to work. There was a battle scene and she could not get it to work. And she tried and tried and tried, and it just would not work. And then one night she's lying asleep and her character comes to her. And everybody next to her is going, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm going, the character comes to her and she says, look, I need you to participate in this battle scene. And he says, I don't want to be in a battle scene. He says, I don't want to fight. And she says, okay, what do you want to do? And he says, I want to party. So she changed the whole ending of her book so that it would end in this big party, to which my writer sense says, how good could the ending have been if you could throw it out that easily? You know, how important was the ending if you could just chop it off?
Right.
And they go down the line, and every single person is talking about how the characters talk to them and have conferences with them, and the plot tells them where it needs to go, and they interact with it. And they get to me, and I just sat there. I looked at the audience for a second. I said, if I ever had a character come to me and tell me that he was not going to participate in the climactic scene of the book, I would kill him.
I don't doubt it.
You don't have that option.
You are not gentle on your characters.
No, I'm not. And I create them. I don't talk to them.
Yeah.
I don't experience them, except in a kind of intellectual sense. To me, it's much more like creating a perfect sculpture than interacting with the actual story. And I seem to be kind of rare, because almost every time I'm on a panel where we discuss that, everybody else is talking about being in their world and talking to their characters, and I'm just like in a different universe. I just write. Or
they're just over romanticizing it a little bit.
Yeah. But they don't get to tell me what the plot is going to be.
So as you sculpt and chisel away at your characters, like how many times do you go through your book once it's done to really, really sculpt them? Or do they just come out?
I do it little by little. So what I'll do is when I sit down to work, I'll go over the few chapters right before what I'm doing, and I'll refine them and I'll polish them. And that like gives me a running start and some momentum into the part I haven't written yet. So the editing is, as I go along, is kind of a vital part of getting the whole thing done. So it's rare there's going to be something that I haven't polished a lot. But you do get to the end sometimes and you have to go back and change things or add them. I got to the end of Nightborn and my editor caught a few things that could have been clearer or could have been developed more, character traits that could have worked better. When we released the ARC, the Advanced Reader Copy for reviews, that of course is a galley. That's not the finished book.
Right.
That's like the last proof at that point, but it's not finished. So I got a couple of reviews that said, I love the book, but this thing didn't work. And I'm like, well, this thing can still be changed. So we're good, you know?
Yeah.
So I got a little feedback on that level at the point when a few little glitches could still be fixed.
That's good.
I don't usually go back and change the whole thing. I'm usually planned enough and controlled enough that the book overall is doing what I want.
Yeah.
You know?
So you haven't written any books where you've just like thrown them out afterwards? Like, I can't do anything with this.
No,
never gotten to that point. Yeah.
Never. no, it's just no. I don't have anything to elaborate upon that.
Yeah.
I've had a few stories that I just didn't have enough interest to go back to, but those are just little stories where the idea kind of wasn't exciting me the way it needed to. And some of them, I sit there for years and then I do come back to them.
Yeah.
One of them I was writing, probably the best story I've ever written in my life. It's called Downtime. And it was in the DAW 30th anniversary volume. And it deals with a woman coming to terms with her mother's death, with a technology that it would allow her mother to kind of borrow her body and have last days in her body and be able to walk around the world. And it deals with the emotional impact of that kind of technology and connecting to her mother's death. While I was writing the story, my mother died. And it was extremely painful. And I could not even approach the story for another 10 years. I mean, I just couldn't look at it. But when I did, a lot of what my mother said to me about dying is in there now. You know, a lot of the things she said that she wanted that were kind of counterintuitive, like if I could have a last day, you know, without the pain and without the weakness, this is what I would want. That inspired a lot of stuff in the story.
Wow.
And then I had one where I won't go into details again because I'll probably publish it someday, but the framework of the plot was a fantasy setting of somebody basically coming to Congress and trying to get them to get involved in a fantasy war. And the joke was that it would go through all the kind of back and forth between the parties that you have whenever we go to war about, are we going to help someone? What about the budget? And then Russia invaded Ukraine.
Oh,
and that is on a
not good timing.
At this point, that is so political. There is no way it could be smiling and lighthearted.
Right.
It's just too real.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Because the big question is, what has that got to do with us? And it's a bigger question in fantasy story, because really, what has it got to do with us? You know, it's not even a human race thing. But those are the exact debates they're having, and you just can't go there while it's fresh.
No. So you'll return to that one.
I'll return to that one. I've got a long list of little stories to finish up someday. But
so you have lots of coals in the fire still. Lots
Since
of
I know the ending of all my books.
Yeah. Is that what you come up with first, the ending?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Well, I know the setup.
Yeah.
I know the world. I know the characters. And I know what story I'm heading towards. And I might tweak or change it a little, but basically that's where I am going. In Nightborne, there's an incident in it, Casca's crazy action, which you actually know because it's in the prologue to volume 2 in the trilogy. Right. So you know some of the story. So it has to go to there. It has landmarks that it has to follow getting to there because they were mentioned before. And then my question was, well, what happens after that? I mean, this was a world-shaking event. What happened 5 minutes after the prologue ends, you know? And I had to decide what that was. And I couldn't write the story till I knew what that was. And the path there might change a little bit. But, you know, if the ending of a book is not satisfying, then the whole book isn't satisfying. You've got to have that punch at the end where it wraps things up and it gives you an emotional thrill. And if you just kind of wander through it waiting to see where it goes, I mean, my objection to that is that if I'm just waiting to see where the story goes, well, the reader can do that too. I'm not going to surprise the reader by going, oh, here's a scene. Yeah, that would lead to this. I have to craft something where you think that would lead to this, and actually it leads somewhere else.
Yeah.
So to some degree, anything that you would guess would happen, I can't use.
So do you try that out on family or friends? Like have them predict what might happen and then you go the other way just to test them?
I'm pretty good at it. I'm pretty good at thinking weirdness. I have a very good beta crew. I have half a dozen people who have been my beta readers for a long time. And I think they are very important for any writer, no matter how professional you get. And I chose them all because they give me really, really good criticism. So I can send them a chapter and I can say, okay, the character's about to do something he shouldn't do. Have I justified it? Because my pet hatred, my big pet peeve in fiction is when people do things stupidly to make the plot go forward.
Right.
Big in horror. But I mean, Alien. Ripley's going to go back and get the cat because the cat got lost. I'm sorry. There's a big monstrous thing that's killed all the crew. You barely get away. You barely escape. Now's your last moment to get away from the ship. And
he has to save Jonesy.
Something. At that point, the cat has made his choice, and the cat is staying behind on the spaceship. but they had to come up with a reason that she would stupidly go back into the ship. And almost every story has some stupid moment.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime I do something that's where the character has questionable judgment, I really need feedback from people. And this was a big one because Casca's actions that are in the prologue are insane. They're literally insane. And you can figure that everybody who came to this planet was certified sane. They wouldn't have been sent to a colony otherwise. They're sane, stable, intelligent, scientific-minded people. And he goes off the deep end so badly that he does what he does. And as a result of that, somebody else then has a breakdown. And both of them are doing things that in a calm, rational world, they would never in a million years do. So I have to justify it enough that they're not just being stupid.
Mm-hmm.
I have to show you the mental breakdown stage by stage so that you get why they're doing this. And that was a lot of my editor's criticism for this one, is we went back to the scenes where those two decisions are taking place. And I had to make absolutely sure that the reasons they were doing this were clear to the reader. Because if they weren't, then it's just a stupid thing to further the plot.
And back to Tarrant then. So did the idea for Damien come before or after Tarrant? How did you decide to create Damien?
Damien was actually kind of inspired by a friend of mine. I almost nothing that I write is ever inspired by real people.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a kind of heavy-set guy, strong, but kind of jovial, a little bit on the sarcastic side. And it was just that mix of qualities that I really liked. So, and that was when he was gaming, he could make characters that just, just express that freely.
Yeah.
And I just like that. It seemed to work for me. And it seemed like such a good foil for Tarrant, which is really what Damien is.
Exactly.
Yeah. They're equal in the story. Hopefully they're equally interesting, but Damien was designed for Tarrant. Tarrant's the evil anti-hero star, if you will.
And so when creating Erna and researching the world, like the geology of the world and coming up with that, like how much outside research did you have to do?
I read tons of science. You have no idea how much science you have to read to not write about the science. Even just describing the chain of volcanoes that's going down through one of the oceans, I had to go find the precedents on Earth. I had to see what was possible. Hopefully I don't screw it up.
No, the geology looked pretty good to me, and I'm a geologist, so it's good.
I mostly got right.
Yeah.
But then we had the Christmas tsunami, and I went, holy shit, I did not get that all right, So there were small things, but there were little things that people would have been doing differently if they really had that problem of frequent tsunami on one shoreline. I tried to get it all right. I did it as right as I could. And all of that's big extrapolation. Like in Nightborne, when they're trying to figure out where to land, normally they'd go near a river, a source of water, source of transportation. They can't go near anything that connects to the oceans because they're going to get massive tidal waves and tsunami coming down through the channels from the ocean regularly, and they can't put anything on the shore there. So every single decision they make, the geology of that planet is forcing them into certain directions. And I can't make that work without understanding the science.
Yeah. And I read in your biographical night, I think, in it, When True Night Falls, that you went to the South Pacific to actually see some volcanoes.
I did. And the coolest thing was, go hold up that book. Hold up that book. Michael Whalen did this painting before I did that. Oh, no, the first book.
You did the research for Crown of Shadows, but it was at the end of that.
No, wrong one. Black Sun Rising.
Oh, you want Black Sun Rising. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, we called them brain trees. See the trees with like the little things like that. I thought they were so creative and awesome. They're described as having all the branches tangled together, so that's where it comes from. But he came up with the shape, and then I went with my mom to Hawaii, and we're driving down a road, and suddenly I'm like, "Oh my God, stop!" And I'm pointing, and there are the trees.
They were there. Oh.
And now you can show the When True Night Falls, and these white stark trees with the black land. That's Hawaii. That's the Trail of Devastation.
I love these trees, the chapter with those.
Where the volcano fried all the trees. It burned them, it seared them, and the ground was totally black. But I hadn't seen it till after I wrote the book. And when I got there, I'm like, I am so sure Michael Whalen was in Hawaii, because all the images he's been using for my series were from Hawaii. Yeah, and which is, by the way, like the single most amazing place in the entire world to visit. And we went to see the volcanoes because so much of the books deal with volcanoes, you know, and they deal with the geology around volcanoes. I needed to see it.
Yeah.
Of course, I went to the snake one.
Have you done any more have you traveled to other places for any of your other books for research?
No, not really. But we traveled around a lot when I was a kid, so I've seen a lot of things. I have had a couple of books and scenes set in the American Southwest, which I love, the Colorado Plateau, which is with all the red rhinestones, the red sandstone. And in one place where there are like painted stripes of sandstone that you can see swirling across mountains and things, that shows up in the Magister trilogy. Part of the Dreamwalker series takes place out in the Southwest. That landscape to me, with the bare red rock, the brutal desert, and then the bits and pieces of verdant green on mesa tops and in canyons. It's so dramatic. It's so incredibly beautiful. And then that led to also using Petra, which is in Jordan, which is the same type of landscape, but where they actually carved houses into the sandstone. So there's like a whole little village of houses and a big thing with columns on it, and they just carved the house out of the rock.
Yeah.
But it's that same reddish sandstone environment. So the fact that I saw that as a kid absolutely influenced it. And I'm in an area with tons of caves too. There's a lot of caves in the trilogy, and tons of them here. I'm next to the Shenandoah Valley, and like every 2 miles is another tourist cave. So we have Luray, which are the big dramatic ones with the colored lights, but we have a lot of little ones too. And I would go and I would wander around the caves, seeing what they really looked like and getting a feel for them, which I hope, you know, I hope worked. And actually in Dreamwalker, they go down into the caves near Luray. So they're literally in that spot. And sometimes he did research that made them look at you askance. Like one day, my brother came with me and we were walking through the cave. And I'm thinking at that point, this is near one point where I know Damien's going to have to go crawling through a little space that he can barely fit through. And I have this image in my head. And we pass by this little space, like just big enough for a person. And in the middle of it, there's this stalactite standing up in the middle, kind of thin, about that big. And the guy goes, do you have any questions? And I'm looking at this and thinking, that's the setting I need for that moment in the book. And I said, finally got to me, and I said, okay, if a 200-pound guy, fully outfitted, you know, carrying a lot of gear, were to throw all his weight against that stalagmite, would it break? Dead silence in the cavern. And you know, it's sinking in then that I've just asked the tour guide how to break the stalactite, you know, and possibly he doesn't know there's a novel being planned here.
Yeah.
So yeah, sometimes you try to do research and you wind up asking very weird questions of people. Like in the end of the Coldfire Trilogy, I got an endurance rider, which they ride as far as they can on a horse without killing the horse. And I'm like, how far can you go if you don't care if the horse dies at the end? But it has to live long enough to get you there.
Yeah.
But if it's exhausted enough that it doesn't survive till tomorrow, you don't care. He was so appalled I was asking the question. It took forever to get him to understand what we're talking about, you know, that this is just fiction.
Right.
The answer was about 100 miles. The answer was they could probably push the horse about 100 miles.
And that's just in one shot. Like without
I forget if it was one shot or 2 days. It was, I don't think it was one day for the 100.
Okay.
But if you pushed the horse every waking minute as fast as you could get the horse to go, but you were trying to do what you could to keep it alive, but that did not include long breaks.
Okay.
You see, it's a kind of balancing act here. They knew they needed the horses to not drop dead before they got where they were going. So they couldn't just like push them like in Gladiator till the horse literally drops. But I needed to know about how far the horse could get when being treated like that before it broke them down too much. And it was about 100 miles. So that's what he told me.
Okay.
They did about 25 miles a day in competition. So
Yeah, we just get so used to cars that it just does not seem that far.
No, it doesn't. And that's the map issue,
Yeah.
because that's the trip they take from the east to the west. They have to get there. They have to get through the pass of a mountain range. And I can't extend that time because of the horse thing.
Right.
And also they have to interact with other plots going on at the same time, which can't have a month to develop. So the map all has to be, when I was trying to do a map, I would have little strings and I would like, okay, here's a day's travel, pin it here, they have to get here. Let's see how far,
Yeah.
Now let's see how it interacts with this one. And at one point I was just, screw it, it's not going to have a map.
Yeah, it's a big puzzle.
It's a big puzzle. So I promise the reissue will have a map. No question about it.
Oh, that's so exciting.
And that'll probably go on my website when we get it done so that all the old fans can find it.
Yeah.
How would they know there's another book? It's been so long, you're not looking for it.
Yeah.
So things like this really help me get the word out a lot for the people who love those books, that there is something more coming that they really want to get hold of.
Yeah, and it's exciting. It's exciting that you're expanding the timeline and like mapping it out, and there's going to be more in that world now.
I could not do the project without the timeline. It just wouldn't physically be possible, because I couldn't keep track of what was happening. And there are so many eras that I hinted at, or had in my brain that weren't even hinted at, that you guys haven't seen. I think there's a reference to the time of false messiahs, where basically when they first discovered that if you worship a god, the god shows up. And imagine what that did to human society and what they had to do to sort of end it. So there are all sorts of spiritual and psychological wars. And it's mentioned they tried to genocide the Rock at one point, that the Rock created the canopy to protect themselves. So, I mean, think of that story when humans suddenly discovered that something is becoming like humans, and maybe that's not good.
Right, because humans tend to feel threatened when something else intelligent.
Well, also, not to give away things, but you also have the Yezu who feed on human emotion, who have certain emotions they want.
Right.
And if they decide that someone trying to kill off a native species would generate the emotions they want, they might interfere in human affairs to make that happen. So you don't have a clean playing field. Once you know about the Yezu, we do not have a clean playing field on this planet at all.
Yeah.
And I suspect Celeste is going to show up in a lot of the earlier scenes. We realize what hand has been tweaking human history.
Do you see an earlier book that's entirely focused on Callista?
Not entirely, because I don't want to do a Knight's Master thing with him. I don't want to make him attractive, appealing, or that interesting. I mean, he is, from our point of view, evil, and a particularly repellent evil. It's not even malignance that matters. He feeds on people.
Right. Or from like more closely from like one of his victims' perspectives.
I can't see it being a long story. I just now when I deal with the Rock story.
There's a lot there.
I mean, that's where it is. And that's where the mentality of these people who are coming under his influence, that's his story. The rocking genocide is Callista's story. That will happen. And I'm also looking at possibly a younger Gerald Tarrant thing when he was still alive. That's very problematic for a number of reasons. But I have come up with a mind-blowing twist explaining why the darkness was able to take root in him when it did. I mean, we know the story.
That's exciting.
He got scared of death. He did this, and this. That's where he went. But if you find out that something that another being manipulated that kicked that off, the entire story shifts. Because you have to wonder what's enough to make someone like
do that.
Psychopath, sociopath technically.
And when I picked up Black Sun Rising, I had no idea really what it was about. So Jordan teaches high school, and he was teaching Black Sun Rising in his sci-fi and fantasy lit course. And he was reading it for the first time too, along with the students, and he's just like, you have to read this, you'll love this, just read it. And he wouldn't even tell me what it was about. He'd give me nothing. And so I read the first chapter, and I got the first POV. I'm like, oh, this is nice. And then I got to the end of that chapter, and I'm like, okay, did not see that coming. Here we go.
I had one of my readers said to me, he says, I know your books, and that's the only reason that after that first chapter I kept reading. Because I knew you'd make a good story out of it, but that was bad. That was
I just
hard.
like was really just not expecting that at all. I'm like, oh, this is just going to be this nice fantasy. She loves her husband. It's going to be, I don't know.
And it looks kind of fairy tale.
It does. It does seem very fairy tale. And I was like, okay, no idea.
And now I have to really work out what knowledge survived.
Yeah.
Because one of my favorite themes is that the past gets easily forgotten. We don't know the truth of what happened 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
But people told stories. A lot of the cities are named after things that aren't what people thought they were. I mean, there's a Lord of the Rings reference. There's a King Arthur reference. 1,200 years after they lost the original books and library and just told stories, the Ernans aren't as aware that that was fiction and not, actually part of the history. And in Nightborn, I had to work out, what did they say for now? They had a neo-Gothic period that works. I know why the medieval flavor worked. Now I have to go back. Who decided to save the fairy tales? Who decided that of everything they were going to record, that mattered? Who drew the pictures of the Gothic buildings and said, something built 3,000 years ago, we need to have a picture of that to give our grandchildren? Because anything that somebody didn't decide to keep, there was a visual record. How do they know what horses are? Someone had to draw horses and detail what a horse was for Tarrant.
So when they came over on the ships, they had paper libraries?
No, they had the data banks.
Right. But
and he mentions it in the prologue that when all the data banks go and they've lost the library and they have nothing, and he says, we are going to have to write down everything we know because that's all we're going to have. And she says, people are not going to want to do that right now. They're kind of like totally stunned. Yeah. And he said, we have to. That's it. That our entire culture, everything we save is going to be based on what these people can physically write down with a pen on a piece of plastic, as it turns out, because, they don't have a lot of paper. And those are the only things that lasted, that and oral transmission of stories. Mm-hmm. So now I'm dealing with having to justify every single thing that happens in the whole trilogy in terms of knowledge that they had or did not have, because somebody had to want to save it. Somebody had to feel it was worthwhile.
How much can you get away with if like a certain part of it is like human nature kind of ingrained in us, like certain structures work, like as far as like architecture goes, for example, certain structures work because they're more stable.
Well, in the neo-Gothic movement, they're actually keying into that whole fairy tale thing. Mm-hmm. A lot of people ask, like, why do so many fairy tales have to do with kings and queens and the feudal system, And the answer is, and why so many fantasies are in that setting? The answer is we grow up with fairy tales, which are in that setting. We have a natural association of that kind of romanticized feudalism with the fantasy subjects. There are reasons that the people who kicked that off, and Tarrant encouraged it a lot, felt that that would be a good thing. It helped establish a social order. It helped rein in on some chaos that was happening. It was all about controlling the Fae. But now I have to ask myself, how many people drew pictures of medieval costume? What did they really know? What did they think? Did they have generations of history lessons when somebody described all the periods of old Earth? I mean, you have some people who want to cling to Earth as much as possible, and some people who are like, we're off, we're not connected, we need to go do our own thing and forget that. Mm-hmm. And now I have to kind of work out that whole dynamic in my head, whereas before I could just hint at the fact that it happened.
Yeah, but at least the structure is there. Just details,
right? I know the ages. Everything passed through.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the big events is the great war between good and evil, when basically the church comes after Tarrant in the forest. And that's a big one. Not
Yeah.
ready for that one yet, but definitely someday.
So what's your favorite world you've created?
Oh, definitely Erna with
It
all
is Erna.
the
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
They say it's a little bit depressing to do something so great that you feel in your gut you're never going to equal it, but everybody's got their masterpiece. Everybody's got their moment, the perfect storm
Yeah.
of creativity when everything came together. And that was mine,
Yeah.
and I'm pleased going back to it now because I'm not going to create something else which has that power, because that was like the absolute peak of what I could create. That was the peak of my creativity. But I can go back to it and I can re-immerse myself and start creating new things in that context and develop it further.
And I think sci-fi and fantasy readers really appreciate, because there is a learning curve to any kind of sci-fi or fantasy, just what is going on in the world,
Right,
what is the
exactly.
language. So just being able to go back to it,
Yeah.
I think we really appreciate that.
And I had so much in my head that I never told anybody about. I mean, the time of the false messiahs, I don't even think it's mentioned, but such a big story. Very few people have ever asked me why there's no Christianity. And it's not just because I'm Jewish. But there is a church that's obviously modeled on Christian traditions. So they took the images, they took the hierarchy, they took the concept. The monotheistic God obviously comes from Judeo-Christian tradition. Why aren't there people talking about Jesus Christ? And that is a very specific story, which basically amounts to the fact that the image of Christ was God appearing in human form. And you have desperately scared people trying to be saved to a God that is known to appear in human form. You're on Erna, what's going to happen?
Right.
So agonizingly painful moment when a generation realizes, for as long as that image of God is alive, they will not be able to control this world. They just can't. I mean, Jesus is showing up on everybody's doorstep, and they wouldn't even know if the real one showed up. They wouldn't be able to tell.
Exactly.
So for that generation, it was a tremendous sacrifice because, yeah, they believed the whole thing. They needed Jesus for salvation. This was what kept them, from hell. And they were going to deny their kids that so that their kids could live, so their kids could survive. So that is one of the great and most dramatic stories in the series. But it amazes me how few people have asked me why that's missing. Maybe they just assume I just, didn't care for it and left it off. But
yeah, I think maybe because it is fantasy, it's just kind of accepted that religion's going to be different, but this fantasy is unique in that it's rooted in science fiction. So the humans
us.
came from Earth.
Right.
And so I think it's easy to forget that while you're reading it.
Well, that was kind of the point. I mean, in the trilogy, the background.
Yeah.
Intellectually.
Yeah.
But the world has existed. The world has existed for so long. And there are moments like when you see the boy where he's got the equivalent of rock posters on the wall. I wanted this to be a familiar world where you say, these are our descendants. I believe that. These are believably what my descendants would do after 1,200 years of dealing with this planet. But that doesn't necessarily connect with everything. You do kind of tend to just accept if some things are missing.
Yeah.
So as you can see, lots of stories to tell in the background to the trilogy. And that's where I'm going to go, because as you know, that I can't refer to very strongly without spoilers, enough things change at the end of the trilogy that the same type of story isn't possible anymore.
Exactly.
So I can't go beyond that point.
You have an end point. Yes.
There is an end point to the trilogy, and it is an end point to an era.
Yeah.
And the next era won't be as interesting. So
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So you have some Coldfire plans. Do you have any? And we talked about your plan with possibly that war that's brewing that you can't deal with yet because it's not the right time. Do you have any other plans?
I'm also going to work on the Outworld series. This Alien Sure was probably my biggest science fiction hit. Won great acclaim. The Times loved it. People love the neurodiversity of it and the concept of a world where that was accepted. And so I did a sequel, This Virtual Night. and the next one will be This Variant Seed, and it's really dark. It's really dark. And my readers wanted more main characters with severe mental conditions, because in the first book, one of the main characters is autistic. In the second book, the mutations we're dealing with are kind of minor and don't really affect the story as much. And they really want to go back to the fact where we're in the head of somebody who is not neurotypical. We want to explore it. We want to see what their world looks like to them. So kind of going to go back in that direction a little, but that is the only thing I've written that was designed to have multiple stories.
So when you're in that headspace and when you're writing something that dark, do you have to come up to the light? Do you have to get out of it? Do you have to take breathers while you're working on it?
Not in that sense. Again, I'm an intellectual craftsman. It's a sculpture. I'm not immersion. So I have to understand it enough to craft an image of it, but I don't live it. And I seem to be fairly rare in that, because it seems to be more common for authors to really get into their story to understand it. I am always standing on the outside, picking the words to craft it.
Yeah. All right. So, yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add in? Anything you want the viewers to know? Like how should they reach out to you? How should they keep up with your updates? What is the best way to stay in touch?
I'm on Facebook under C.S. Friedman, and everybody should come to Facebook. And I'm not that active on it, but they'll get all the updates. And we've done some polls and things. And actually, the title for Nightborne was actually suggested by one of the people on Facebook. And I asked them, I said, give me a title, let's go. And there were all sorts of wonderful suggestions, and people said which one they liked most, and it grew out of there. I have a Patreon page, which obviously anyone's support is greatly appreciated, because writing does not pay all that well, and it's really being helpful. But we're also building a very nice community there. I'm currently running a contest for my patrons, using AI to develop some fantasy concepts connected to my book, and it's a kind of funny contest. So hopefully there'll be lots more to do. There's a whole fan art section where the fans are showing off their art to each other. So please come join us on Patreon. That's the place too. And other than that, I don't do a lot of social media. So those are really the two biggies.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Celia. And remember to pick up Nightborne on July 18th. And the best place to do that, it's on Amazon, it's in Barnes & Noble. Everywhere.
It's a real book. Unlike when I self-published Dominion, it's a real book.
Yeah.
Yes, pick it up and pre-order it if you want to, because that makes publishers very happy, which makes me very happy.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll see you next time.